In the mid-1700s, areas west of the Appalachian Mountains were the frontier. The rivers and Indian paths through the mountains provided a path westward for European expansion. Along with that expansion came dangers and a need for protection. Stick around. Life on the frontier in the 18th century was fraught with danger. Highwaymen and criminals threatened travelers, and Native Americans raided the farms and villages of the settlers who were occupying their lands. In order to provide protection from all types of raiders, forts sprung up across the region. From small private blockhouses where a few families could find refuge, to government-designed and built forts with artillery and garrisoned by either militia or regular soldiers. They were a common sight to travelers heading westward. South central Pennsylvania had a number of these forts, most lost to time, with little in the way of detailed documentation. Several of them have been restored and are open to visitors, while others are remembered only through the occasional historical markers along the highway approximating their location. Now, you know, the best way to support the channel is to like our videos and subscribe. It costs you nothing and it really helps us out. Now, if you'd like to help out with my coffee habit with a couple of bucks, there's a link in the description to our Buy Me a Coffee page. Fort Loudon was built in 1756 as part of a line of forts ordered by the Pennsylvania General Assembly to protect settlers on the western frontier of the English colonies. In 1758, it served as a point of protection for the Forbes expedition as they cut 200 miles of road through the Pennsylvania wilderness on their way to defeat French forces at Fort Duquesne. The British troops garrisoned here were responsible not only for the protection of the settlers in the area, but also the defense and maintenance of their portion of the Forbes Road, an important route west for men and supplies. It was garrisoned by at least a skeleton force after the war, until the British abandoned it in 1765 and the land was returned to farming. It was at the end of that short lifespan in 1765 the event for which the fort is best known occurred, the Allegheny Uprising, also known as the Black Boys Rebellion. Following the French and Indian War and Pontiac's Rebellion, the British imposed strict controls on what items could be traded with the native people. Items that were embargoed were primarily the implements of war, such as guns, powder, shot, scalping knives, and things like that. But there are always profits to be made by smugglers. More importantly, the British were in negotiations to ease some of those trade restrictions. And to the colonists, who had endured years of bloody raids by the natives during nearly 10 years of war, that was an untenable thought. So they took it upon themselves to try to enforce those trade restrictions and maybe got a little too, shall we say, aggressive in the way they went about it. When merchants complained that goods destined for British forts was being intercepted and destroyed by these raiders, Fort Loudon responded and engaged a group known as the Black Boys. Whether that name came from attempts to disguise their identities or for their meetings in a village named Blacktown is lost to history. But the uprising resulted in the colonists laying siege to Fort Loudon and forcing the Highlanders garrisoned there to retreat to Fort Bedford. The reconstructed fort stockade was completed in 1993 by the Fort Loudon Historical Society on the site identified as the original fort in 1980's archaeological digs. Even though the land the fort sits on is owned by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the Historical Society operates the fort, continues to expand the buildings and offerings on the site. The site is open for special event weekends and is a favorite of reenactors of all eras.
That linstock that you see right there, That linstock that you see right there is a piece of wood that around it has this thing that's wrapped. It's called a piece of slow match. Slow match is simply rope that has been saturated in black powder.
This is about 15 pounds. You can hold it if you'd like and see.
Years after the construction of Fort Loudon, the colonies found themselves in rebellion to the British Empire. Lead for shot for muskets was a critical resource, and the British blockade precluded the Continental forces from getting lead from Europe. In 1778, General Daniel Roberdeau heard of lead ore being found in Sinking Springs Valley, now called Sinking Valley, near present-day Altoona. He proposed a plan to General Washington to mine and smelt that ore and ship it to Harrisburg area for processing. Part of his plan was a fort to protect the operation from Loyalist and native raiders. The fort was only garrisoned for 2 years by militia and rangers from Bedford County. With the entry of France as an ally of the colonies, the British blockade was broken, and once again, lead could flow from Europe in quantities much greater than the Fort Roberdeau operation could supply. There was never any hostile action at Fort Roberdeau, though there is a story of several rangers chasing away and pursuing natives who were observing the fort. The exact site of the original palisade was long thought to be lost to history, and was often thought to be some distance away from the reconstructed fort. Finally, in the spring of 2024, a team from Juniata College was able to establish the location of the original fort. It turns out that the 18th century version of the fort was considerably larger than the reconstruction, which actually does overlap with the area occupied by the original fort. The reconstruction was completed in 1976 as part of Blair County's bicentennial celebration and is operated as a county park. It is open May to November for guided tours with many special events featuring living historians.
Riflemen couldn't do this.
Yep, that's bayonet.
And let me show you.
See.
About 35 miles south of Fort Roberdeau was Fort Bedford. Much like Fort Loudon, Fort Bedford was built during the French and Indian War on the road British General Forbes built and used in his attack on the French Fort Duquesne. It too was abandoned by the British shortly after Pontiac's rebellion. It did, however, survive into the Revolutionary War and was garrisoned at that time by the Patriot-aligned Bedford County Militia. President George Washington stopped in Bedford in 1794 when he was leading troops into western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Documentation of that time indicates the fort had already been razed. Unlike Fort Loudon and Roberdeau, archaeologists have failed to positively identify the original location of Fort Bedford. Documents have established a pretty good location. A blockhouse-style museum was completed near that presumed site in 1958 to celebrate the construction of the fort 200 years earlier. Today, the museum is operated by the Bedford Heritage Trust and documents the history of Bedford County from long before Europeans arrived to more modern times.
So the story goes with this beautiful flag that is, during the French and Indian War, that a British officer requested be brought off a naval ship so he could have a flag at the fort. So furthermore, later on, fast forward to the end of the American Revolution, Some newfound American teenagers decided to be just a little rowdy and liberate it from a British officer who was in town, which they did so successfully. He evaded all the search parties and all the talking mouths, and no blood was shed. So for that time period, it was rather impressive. Fast forward a little bit to about the 1920s. The surviving members of that family passed it on to a board. They held on to it. This fort was built in 1958. About 1963, we finally got the flag. 1993, we had it sent away, tested, and authenticated. Found out that it is an authentic flag from that era, and possibly one of 4 flags that have been left on the American continent. This is the only one that is surviving.
Hope you enjoyed this look at some of the forts that protected the area when it truly was the Wild West of what would become the United States. Thanks for coming along, and as always, till the next trip, have a great week.